Marcus believed that words built influence until he realized they also revealed too much. In the open-plan office, voices ricocheted off glass walls like tennis balls in a silent tournament. Ideas flew fast, dressed in bullet points and buzzwords. Marcus thrived in it. Each meeting was a stage, and he, confident, articulate, played to the crowd. He had learned early that silence meant invisibility. And invisibility, in this world of constant exposure, was death. He took the lead again today. The Monday Review, an arena for emerging leaders. His deck was polished, his voice modulated, each sentence delivered with just the right pause for effect. Heads nodded, some out of habit, some in genuine agreement. Across the table, Julia scribbled something in her notebook without looking up. Lucius, at the far end, leaned back in his chair, hands folded like a statue. He hadn't spoken all morning. Marcus noticed, but brushed it off. He's old school, he thought. We're in the age of communication. He pressed on, chart after chart, describing growth, potential, projections, his voice filling every corner of the room. There was barely a breath between his points. Then Julia lifted her head. "May I ask," she began, "how your growth projections account for the supplier delays in Asia?" The room hushed. Marcus's rhythm stumbled. He blinked. The delay had been a footnote on slide 12. She had seen it. Lucius didn't flinch. Julia smiled, not smug, but certain. A quiet pause followed. Long enough for Marcus to realize he had been talking too much and listening too little. He recovered with a bland response. The moment passed, but something had shifted. The applause at the end felt thinner. The meeting ended, chairs pushed back, and conversations faded into hallway chatter. Marcus stood still for a moment. His heart still raced, but the high wasn't there. Only the echo of his own voice remained. Back at his desk, he watched the office buzz through the glass. Julia was already in another huddle, speaking low, deliberate. Lucius walked past without a word, offering only a nod. It was enough to make Marcus wonder why the man seemed to carry more weight in silence than he did with paragraphs. He scrolled through his feedback emails. One line stood out from last quarter. "Marcus is enthusiastic and articulate, but often fills space that might benefit from reflection." He minimized the window. The day wound down. Lights dimmed, voices softened, and the building exhaled its end-of-day sigh. Marcus sat still, reviewing the meeting in his mind. Not the words he had said, but the words others hadn't. Why did they listen more when he said less? That question stayed with him as the office emptied, a quiet refrain he couldn't yet answer. Sometimes the harshest mirror is not a face, but a room full of quiet disinterest. The feedback came on a Thursday. Marcus opened the email between meetings, expecting the usual mix of praise and corporate platitudes. What he found instead landed with the weight of a stone in the gut. Marcus is articulate but lacks presence. Talks over others. Strong opinions, weak listening. He reread the words, each one sharper than the last. It wasn't just a critique, it was a dismantling. A mirror held up not to his work, but to the way he moved through rooms, through people. The reflection stared back at him, unfamiliar and cold. In the hallway, sunlight streamed through high windows, painting long rectangles across the floor. Marcus walked slowly, the echo of his own footsteps louder than usual. He passed Julia near the coffee machine. She didn't speak, but her glance lingered. Not hostile, just assessing. That irritated him more than words would have. He approached her anyway. "You read the evaluations yet?" She sipped her coffee, watching the foam settle. "I don't have to," she said, setting the cup down. "They always say the same thing. About you? About everyone. But in your case, maybe listen more. Talk less." He wanted to snap back, to defend himself. But what was there to say? That his words had always worked before? That speaking first felt like winning? That being silent made him feel erased? Julia walked away before he could reply. Later that day, In the quiet of his office, he called up old recordings from team meetings. He listened, headphones on, pen in hand. What he heard surprised him. His own voice dominated. Fast, filled with explanations, assumptions, justifications. He hardly remembered what others had said. Had he ever really heard them? By late afternoon, his desk was a scatter of notes and questions. That's when Lucius knocked, softly, like he already belonged in the room. Marcus looked up. "I heard the feedback made the rounds," Lucius said. Marcus nodded. "Apparently I talked too much." Lucius smiled, not unkindly. "Most people do. The difference is whether they learn to stop." There was a pause. Marcus instinctively filled it. "I thought clarity mattered, that saying things out loud made them real." "It does, sometimes. But power," Lucius said, "doesn't always need a narrator." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" Lucius leaned slightly against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Talking less might feel like losing control. But sometimes silence is what real control looks like." The words unsettled him. They didn't make immediate sense, but they landed in the same place the feedback had struck, deep in the gut, where performance ends and perception begins. That evening, Marcus stayed late. The office emptied around him. Lights dimmed. Screens went black. He sat, staring at nothing, the feedback echoing in his mind. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to speak his way out. Lucius's voice came back to him. "Talking less might feel like losing, until you start winning." The silence around him felt heavier than usual, but not empty. More like a space that demanded something different. He didn't know what that was yet. But when Lucius appeared again at the elevator, briefcase in hand and coat over one shoulder, he asked only one thing. "Ready to learn how to say nothing?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Before he taught Marcus how to speak wisely, Lucius taught him when not to speak at all. Lucius's office was unlike the rest of the floor, older, quieter, and strangely serene. The blinds were always slightly drawn. A clock ticked softly in the background, its rhythm unbothered by deadlines or noise. A single bonsai tree stood on the corner of his desk, trimmed with care, a kind of wordless discipline in living form. Marcus stepped inside like a student unsure of what he was supposed to learn. He expected advice, a method, some list of what to say, what not to say. Instead, Lucius simply gestured to the chair across from him and waited. The silence stretched. Marcus shifted. "So, where do we start?" Lucius didn't answer right away. He opened a drawer, pulled out a worn notepad, and laid it gently on the desk. Then, looking directly at Marcus, he said, "We start by noticing." "Noticing what?" "What others miss, what they reveal when they think no one's listening." Marcus frowned. "You mean body language?" Lucius nodded. "That. And how they respond to silence. What fills the space when you don't." He turned the notepad around. On it were 3 handwritten phrases. Information gathering silence, authority, building silence, ambiguity, preserving silence. "These aren't tactics," Lucius said. "They're disciplines." Marcus leaned forward. The words felt foreign but resonant, like puzzle pieces he didn't know he was missing. "So, you're saying silence isn't just the absence of words?" Lucius smiled faintly. "Silence is a strategy. Speech is commitment. Silence is freedom." Marcus absorbed the idea slowly, unsure if he admired it or feared it. "So what now?" Lucius stood, crossed the room, and handed Marcus a small card. "Tomorrow's planning meeting. Say nothing. Just observe. Write what you see, not what you think. Listen not for answers, but for patterns." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is this a trick? Some kind of test?" "It is the first time you all enter a room with power and choose not to use it." The next day came quickly. The morning air was sharp, the office bustling with urgency. In the meeting room, Marcus sat near the middle, notebook open, pen ready, but lips sealed. He felt exposed at first, vulnerable in the silence. Julia spoke first, then another colleague. The conversation darted between updates and concerns. Strategies were thrown around like darts. For once, Marcus didn't contribute. He watched. And he noticed. He noticed how Julia glanced sideways when interrupted. How a junior manager nervously tapped his pen whenever budget came up. How the VP paused just half a second longer before endorsing any idea not his own. The patterns revealed themselves in rhythm and omission, not words. Nobody asked Marcus to speak. Nobody seemed to miss his voice. Yet when the meeting ended, two people approached him quietly. "I liked your expression during that budget suggestion. Didn't realize you saw that coming," one said. "You caught something there, didn't you?" asked another. He only nodded. That afternoon, he returned to Lucius's office. He handed over his notes, now dense with observation, arrows, timing, emotion. Lucius flipped through them with interest, then looked up. "Better than I expected," he said. Marcus half smiled. "Still feels like losing a bit." "It always does," Lucius replied. "Until you win." He reached across the desk and circled one line Marcus had written. "The one who speaks last often understands the most." Lucius leaned back, his voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, use your silence, not just for seeing, but for shaping." He entered the meeting with a voice ready, but left with a silence that echoed louder. The glass-walled conference room on the 21st floor was colder than usual, its long oval table lined with nameplates and polished agendas. The quarterly strategy session had arrived, Marcus's chance to contribute to decisions that shaped the company. 2 weeks ago, he would have rehearsed arguments, fine-tuned slides, planned verbal pivots. Today, he carried only a slim folder and the stillness he had been practicing. He entered quietly, offering nods instead of greetings. Julia was already seated, her presence unmistakable, poised, confident, wrapped in a sleek navy suit. She flipped through her presentation calmly. Around the table, department heads murmured, tension creeping between the usual smiles. Marcus took his seat without ceremony. Lucius entered last and took a spot at the far end, deliberately, without speaking. His hands folded, his gaze calm. The meeting began. Julia was first, as always. Her voice was fluid, confident, laced with urgency. She presented growth options, cited market trends, and painted future scenarios with compelling detail. The room leaned in. Her words filled every corner. Marcus listened, not just to her voice, but to what came after. The silence between slides. The flickers of doubt behind executive eyes. The tiny sigh from the head of finance when projected costs rose too quickly. He marked them all. Halfway through, the CTO raised a concern about server capacity. Julia responded smoothly, but quickly, too quickly. Marcus noted it, the way her answer covered the question without anchoring in data. Others nodded, but it was a fragile consensus. A pause opened in the room, the kind that usually rushed Marcus toward the microphone. This time he waited. Let it breathe. 3 seconds, 5. Then, "Can I ask," Marcus said, his voice steady, "if we've modeled those projections with tiered redundancy costs, especially after the last outage?" The room turned. The CFO blinked. The CTO leaned forward. Lucius didn't move. Julia hesitated, not visibly, but enough for those who were watching. "We included some of that in secondary scenarios," she said carefully. "Were those shared in the packet?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. Silence again. Someone began flipping through the deck. Lucius shifted ever so slightly. Marcus didn't press. He didn't need to. He closed his folder gently and leaned back. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not a void, but a pressure. A quiet that demanded consideration. The discussion resumed, but Marcus had changed the current. Questions sharpened, assumptions rechecked. Julia continued, still composed, but her rhythm had bent slightly around the one moment she hadn't controlled. When the meeting adjourned, no one clapped. That wasn't the culture. But heads nodded toward Marcus. One exec gave a small thumbs up. Even Julia, as she packed her materials, glanced at him with something between annoyance and respect. As the room cleared, Lucius stayed seated. Marcus approached, unsure whether to speak. Lucius didn't look up, but he offered a single sentence. "One question, Marcus." And yet the room turned. It wasn't praise, it was confirmation. On the elevator ride down, Marcus stood alone. He didn't check his phone. He didn't replay the scene in words. He just stood with the silence, an echo still humming from the space where he had chosen not to fill the air. And somewhere behind that silence, something had changed. One executive murmured, "He's changed." The center of gravity had shifted, and this time, it wasn't where the noise came from. The negotiation room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and tension. Two visiting clients from overseas were seated across from Marcus and Julia, their briefcases unopened, their posture unreadable. The deal on the table was delicate, a systems integration worth more than numbers. It was political, strategic, and reputational. Julia took the lead, as expected. She moved with practiced confidence, her cadence upbeat, her slides trimmed to impress. She emphasized speed, scalability, global reach. Every pause was filled before it formed. Every objection anticipated and pre-countered. It was a performance polished to brilliance. Marcus watched. Not her slides, but her rhythm. Not her words, but the flickers in the client's eyes when she spoke of timelines they clearly knew were ambitious. He noticed how one client subtly repositioned his pen every time the word aggressive came up, and how the other, older one, didn't take a single note until Julia stopped talking. When her final slide faded to white, she turned to Marcus with a slight tilt of her head. "Would you like to add anything?" she asked, a hint of challenge beneath the politeness. He nodded, slowly. "Just one question," he said, turning to the older client. "If we paused expansion by 2 months, would that help your teams adapt better before rollout?" A pause. Then a long exhale from the man across the table. "Yes," he said simply. "That would change everything." The younger client smiled for the first time. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. No fireworks, no backpatting. Just a quiet consensus and a far more stable agreement. Back in the debrief room, the atmosphere was brittle. Julia paced near the window. "They responded to delay," she said flatly. "We led with momentum." "They responded to honesty," Marcus replied. "And clarity." Julia looked at him. "You said one thing." Marcus met her gaze. "Exactly." She didn't argue, just gathered her notes and left. Lucius stood in the doorway, unseen until now. He looked not at Marcus, but at the empty chair Julia had left behind. "Noise doesn't equal authority," he said, almost to himself. The next day, the promotion shortlists were posted. 3 names, 2 expected, 1 quiet surprise. Marcus's name was there. Julia's was not. In the hallway, he passed her without gloating. She offered him a stiff nod. No bitterness, only acknowledgement. Something had shifted. Not just in the outcome, but in perception. The orbit had changed. The quiet presence now held the center. And from that center, Marcus said very little. But everyone listened. He didn't celebrate with words, just a quiet breath and a nod to the man who had taught him silence. The email came just after sunrise. It was short, direct, barely 5 sentences. The subject line read, "Appointment confirmed, strategy director. No congratulations, no flourish, just facts." Marcus stared at it for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, the morning light creeping across his desk. He didn't cheer, didn't forward it. He simply closed the laptop and stepped outside. On the rooftop, the city was still waking. Horns in the distance. A single bird traced the sky overhead. Marcus leaned on the railing, the wind tugging at his sleeves. The journey had been quiet, especially toward the end. And in that quiet, something in him had grown stronger than noise ever offered. That evening, A private dinner was held for Lucius's retirement. A dozen executives, small toasts, a bottle of wine aged enough to match his tenure. Marcus sat 2 seats down, speaking little. Lucius, as always, didn't need to dominate the room. His absence would echo louder than most presences. At the end of the night, the CEO stood and offered brief remarks. Gratitude, admiration, the usual lines. Then she turned to Marcus. "Your promotion," she said, "wasn't just about numbers. It was presence. When you spoke, it counted. But more than that, when you didn't, it resonated." Marcus nodded once, said thank you, and nothing more. Later, as the group thinned, Marcus and Lucius stood together outside. No one else lingered in the cold. The city lights shimmered below. "Feels strange," Marcus said finally. "I expected to feel more." Lucius shrugged. "You feel the shift inside. That's where it matters." They stood in companionable silence. Then Lucius handed Marcus a small gift, wrapped in brown paper, unadorned. Inside was the notepad. The same one. The same words. Information-gathering silence, authority-building silence, ambiguity, preserving silence. Nothing more. Marcus smiled. "I'll take care of it." Lucius nodded. "Pass it on, if you meet someone who talks too much." They laughed quietly, a simple, unforced sound. The next morning Marcus arrived early. He stepped into the same glass meeting room, now his. He adjusted the chairs slightly, opened a fresh notebook, and placed Lucius's card beside it. As the team filed in, analysts, leads, juniors, he greeted each with a nod, not a speech. The meeting began. He listened more than he spoke, and when a junior analyst fumbled her point, he didn't correct her. He just asked a better question, and let the silence fill in the gaps. Later that day in the hallway, she caught up to him, nervous, wide-eyed. "Can I ask you something about silence?" Marcus paused, then turned toward her, smiling gently. "Of course." The wind was soft that morning, brushing against the glass where Marcus sat, silent, still, and unhurried. Nothing needed saying. The quiet itself held shape, like the calm before a decision, or the pause between breaths. Sometimes, restraint speaks louder than declaration. Even in silence, discipline endures, and dignity deepens. Perhaps today is another chance to pause before speaking, to hold a moment longer, and to let silence carry what words cannot.